BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Firstly, I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who watched the most recent live stream that came out on this channel, and I'm going to be doing a little bit more interactive content, if you will, doing things like the live streams or Q&A sessions where I can respond to your questions and comments. But welcome to Ripper Wednesday, and on Wednesdays this year, I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the most famous unsolved murder mystery in the world. And Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And in this episode, I'm going to be discussing the Jack the Ripper suspect Francis Thompson, as well as looking at the book Jack the Poet Was Francis Thompson Jack the Ripper by Simon Webb. Now, you might be noticing that this is listed as Part 2, and if you haven't heard Part 1 of this book discussion, that's fine, you can keep listening. I always want this type of content to be made available to anybody. You can jump in the middle, go from the beginning, but this is only going to be a two-part book discussion because this is actually a rather short book. Jack the Poet Was Francis Thompson Jack the Ripper, and just in case you didn't hear Part 1, I'll give the most basic introduction. Francis Thompson was a famous poet, but before he was a famous poet, he was somebody who experienced some instability in his perhaps late teens, early 20s. He was a fairly good student when he was at school, but once he graduated, he just didn't seem to show interest in the careers and professions that his parents were encouraging him to find, particularly being a doctor and then a priest. And in Part 1, I said you could call him a failed priest, a failed doctor, and a failed soldier, but he did have anatomical knowledge because he was a medical student, even if he didn't pass his exams, and he ended up working in a factory that would make the types of instruments that are used in surgery, blades and scalpels and anything of that sort, and he was actually an inspector for these types of products. So he has familiarity with things that could be connected to Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was a very vicious serial killer who not only murdered women, but he also mutilated them, some more severely than others. But Jack the Ripper would more or less disembowel the women whom he attacked, and the organs were pulled out, and very, very vicious and heinous things were done to the women in Whitechapel in 1888. And Francis Thompson becomes a Jack the Ripper suspect, I believe, because firstly, he just seems to have a lot of the psychological elements that people would expect to find in a Ripper suspect or someone who was Jack the Ripper. And this second half of the book by Simon Webb, Jack the Poet Was Francis Thompson Jack the Ripper, looks at the interpretations of his poetry. And that's something that I really didn't spend a lot of time on in Part 1, but there are all of these poetic verses that have been highlighted where they're talking about animosity toward women. And people believe that there are specific markers and indicators that show that Jack the Ripper seemed to have some type of problem with women. And in Part 1 as well, I shared a quote from Richard Patterson, who's the author of the book Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson. And he said that Francis Thompson was having an affair with a prostitute around the time of the Whitechapel murders. And in Simon Webb's book, it says that sometime after 1887, he takes up with a prostitute. And I mean, I watched that interview with Richard Patterson, and I was just simply waiting to hear more about that story. Who exactly was this woman that Francis Thompson was acquainted with? I'm being careful with my language. And she's simply referred to as an unnamed prostitute, but he is somebody who has this conflicting thing that is going on in his type of worldview, where on the one hand he's a deeply religious man, and on the other hand he's somebody who is a drug addict. He is somebody who is having an affair with a prostitute, and quite possibly could have been a murderer. Now, I've read some other types of poetry from the same era, and I really began to notice that, yes, there is a darker and morbid aspect of Francis Thompson's poetry, and it does seem that he is showing certain types of psychological elements that could be similar to a deranged person. Simon Webb uses the term psychopathy in the book, saying that Francis Thompson's critiques of women in his poetry indicate the personality of a psychopath. This is psychopathy. And I'm just not quite convinced of that. And I'll share some things about his poetry later on. But with Francis Thompson, he is a suspect who is all about the profiling, because I did an episode on this channel called The Suspect Ratings, and I was talking about the suspects that I thought were very likely to have been Jack the Ripper, and the top four that I listed were Charles Lechmere, Aaron Kosminski, Joseph Barnett, and Francis Thompson. And somebody responded in the comments section talking about how, there are other suspects who would have a direct form of access to the crime scenes, and they even brought up one whom I listed as a mid-level suspect named George Hutchinson. George Hutchinson is often thought of as a witness in the Jack the Ripper case. He is perhaps someone who saw the Ripper with Mary Kelly on the night that she was murdered, and there's a very large section in Simon Webb's book talking all about George Hutchinson's testimony, and the long and short of it is, he recalls an enormous amount of information about what the person was wearing, very, very extreme and vivid details, and more or less the story is that he saw somebody walking with Mary Kelly and they enter a building, so then he waits outside of the building for at least 45 minutes in the cold in November. This would have been November 9th of 1888. And he's just waiting to see if the guy is going to come out again. And there is this very big divide where some people think that, okay, hands down, this guy, George Hutchinson, has no reason to lie. He saw Jack the Ripper. We need to listen to everything that he is saying. And then there are people, on the other hand, who are saying that this guy seems to have recalled an enormous amount of information when he didn't know what exactly he was looking for, and also that he would have waited for 45 minutes in the cold in November in the dead of night, just standing when it's practically freezing outside, again, not knowing what he was going to find. So they think that he just fabricated his story, talking about the garments that the guy was wearing, talking about how he had this type of watch, he had a pin that had this type of color on it, and that this guy just made it up because he wanted to insert himself in the case, or he wanted to just tell some wild stories for attention. And I definitely do agree with the latter, because, that is something that we just experience in the true crime world. But as far as Jack the Ripper goes, George Hutchinson goes on to become a Jack the Ripper suspect, and at the very least, he has a form of an explanation that can tie up to one of the crime scenes, the murder of Mary Kelly. And then there are other suspects like Charles Lechmere, whom I said has a direct connection to the crime scenes with the murder of Polly Nichols. He's the person, the first witness to find the body. Joseph Barnett also had a connection to Mary Kelly. They lived in the same building. Sometimes he's referred to as a friend, sometimes as a roommate, and they'd even gotten into an argument on October 30th of 1888, if I recall correctly. So those suspects, notice I didn't mention Kosminski, but those suspects whom I just listed off seem to have some type of direct first-hand connection to the crime scenes, whereas Francis Thompson is more of a question mark. Now, would he actually have any reason to be in these particular crime scenes? And the idea that is explored in Simon Webb's book is more or less that Francis Thompson, like many people, would just roam the streets at night. He would wander about. He was a drug addict. He was someone who would perhaps just be moving about at night because that was one of the things that people did. Maybe not in the absolute dead cold, as I said, but it's not completely uncommon. Furthermore, he almost certainly was in England and London and on all of the dates of Ripper activity and would have had access to them because he only lived 18 kilometers from Whitechapel. So that matches up much stronger than some of these other suspects, perhaps such as Michael Ostrog, who was imprisoned in France, and maybe even Frederick Bailey Deeming, who was also imprisoned out of the country, Thomas Neal Cream, imprisoned in the United States, whereas Francis Thompson is in the area, and he does seem like he has a lot of things that could drive him to murder women in a very vicious way, but at the same time, what exactly do we make of the physical evidence? Now, Simon Webb talks about this very clearly in the book Jack the Poet when he says, if Francis Thompson were indeed Jack the Ripper, then that would mean that George Hutchinson's testimony is inaccurate because Francis Thompson almost surely was not this type of well-dressed guy with a gold pocket watch that George Hutchinson saw. Francis Thompson was, as I said, a drug addict roaming the streets. He would have been very shabbily dressed and definitely wouldn't have been someone whom George Hutchinson described. Now that goes two ways. You could just easily say in the opposite, well, that means that Francis Thompson wasn't Jack the Ripper. If what George Hutchinson is saying is true and he actually saw the Ripper and everything about that story is accurate, then Francis Thompson might not have been Jack the Ripper. Either that or he found some nice clothes and was able to buy a nicer watch. And yes, all of that isn't just my own observation and my own ramblings. Those things are included in Simon Webb's book as well, though it's more or less his analysis, just giving him credit for that. But I think that Francis Thompson is a fascinating individual, but we have to go beyond psychological profiling. We have to go beyond interpretations of poetry because that simply isn't hard evidence. That doesn't necessarily mean that his tendencies would have escalated to murder. But one of the big issues that is explored with Jack the Ripper is some people believe that Jack the Ripper was foreign, and some people believe that Jack the Ripper was Jewish. And Simon Webb talks about this in the book as well, saying that if Francis Thompson were roaming the streets shabbily dressed, people are probably going to get just glimpses of the side of his face, and they might think that about him because he's this dark-haired individual who is English. He is English, born and raised in England. However, people could easily mistake him for being a foreigner, and those words aren't exactly stated in the book, but that is something that has been shared and explored all the same. Now, as I said, I used to think very, very highly of Francis Thompson. I mean, to be very honest with you, I said that not only was he in the top 4 suspects for all, he was in my top 2 suspects. I actually thought that there was a very solid chance that he could have been Jack the Ripper, and I had to scale down that a little bit, and as I said, I moved him from a top-tier suspect to about a mid-tier suspect, and I would also include George Hutchinson as a mid-tier suspect as well, and I'll share some things about that in just a second. But because this episode is about Francis Thompson, I'm just not seeing the hard evidence. I'm just not seeing the things that could actually show that he killed anybody. I mean, when you have other Jack the Ripper suspects, such as Carl Feigenbaum, who gets connected to a murder in the United States of America. He was a German sailor, but he went on to, commit a murder in 1894, wasn't it? I mentioned Frederick Bailey Deeming. He was indeed a real murderer, and even some of the other suspects that I was just talking about, Thomas Neal Cream, he was indeed a real murderer, a serial killer called the Lambeth Poisoner. Okay, these guys are murderers, but did Francis Thompson ever kill anyone? I mean, his poetry just shows that he was a guy with a lot of emotion, and he was rather smart, and he would express himself in these ways. Now, here's a side note. And you guys know on Black Box Online Radio, I like going off on side notes and tangents. I have found that historians view poets differently than the literary experts, differently than the literary theorists. And I really noticed this back when I was, just reading things, and I would watch follow-up documentaries about them. And then I found that people like, oh, what great literary genius, what a brilliant mind. And then the historians would say things to the effect of, a lot of people thought this guy was a jerk, but he was really smart, he was really good at what he did, and he had some good ideas that he put into words. With Francis Thompson, I can see a lot of that. I mean, he seems like somebody who was definitely a very emotional person, definitely somebody who wanted to follow his emotions, and the structure of his school years provided a very strong foundation for him. Well-behaved person in class, but definitely not very aggressive. And then once he got into his adulthood and he had more possibilities and more options, it seems like he was just kind of bouncing around in them because he didn't really care too much. He just wanted to deal with these emotional things, or he wanted to deal with his own ideas. And I've said this before about serial killers, that I think a lot of them use thinking as their refuge. And that might sound a little bit weird, but thinking is almost their form of solitude. It's like the fortress of solitude, getting lost in their own mind, and it's an escape from reality. It's an escape from the problems that they have. And somebody like Francis Thompson seems like he would have cared very much about that, just kind of getting lost in his own imagination, spinning words into poems, as opposed to, being a doctor, a soldier, or a priest. But I told you I did have a follow-up about the Jack the Ripper suspect, George Hutchinson, and I think it's reasonable that he gets incorporated into the Jack the Ripper suspects because he has a direct connection to not only the crime scene, but the reason why he has this connection to the crime scene is because he was acquainted with Mary Kelly as well. And they even talk about this in the Barlow and Watt presentations that were available on YouTube when they say something to the effect of, if you had seen a man who had been with a woman whom you had been with, you'd get a good look at him too. And that also creates things like animosity, jealousy, reasons about how and why he is doing what he is doing, and he's a suspect whom I can explore further on these Jack the Ripper Wednesdays. But right now, I would like to conclude with a poem from Francis Thompson, and this is called The Nightmare of the Witch Babies. This is a specific poem that was highlighted by Simon Webb in his book Jack the Poet Was Francis Thompson, Jack the Ripper, and an example of how he believes that the poetry of Francis Thompson leaves clues into his mental state, and as I said, the exact word that is used is psychopathy. The Nightmare of the Witch Babies. 2 witch babies, ha ha, 2 witch babies, ho ho, of a demon-ridden hag with the devil pigged alone, begot them late at night, oh the bloody rusted stone, and they dwell within the land of the bare shark bone, where the evil goes to and fro. 2 witch babies, ho ho ho, a lusty knight, ha ha, on a swart steed, ho ho, rode upon the land where the silence feels alone, rode upon the land of the bare shark bone, rode upon the strand of the dead man's groan, where evil goes to and fro. 2 witch babies, ho ho ho. A rotten mist, ha ha, like a dead man's flesh was abhorrent in the air, clung to a tether to the wood of the wicked-looking trees, was a scruff upon the flood, and the reeds, they were pulpy, with blood, 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 and the clouds were looming low. 2 witch babies, ho, ho, ho. No one life there, ha, ha, no sweet life there, ho, ho, but the long loud laugh, and the short shrill howl, and the quick brisk flip of the horned owl, as he flits past, with his gloomy cowl, through the murkiness long and low. 2 witch babies, ho, ho, ho. What is it, sees he? Ha, ha, there in the frightfulness, ho, ho, there he saw a maiden fairest fair, sad were her dusk eyes, long was her hair, sad were her dreaming eyes, misty her hair, and strange her garments flow. 2 witch babies, ho, ho, ho. Swiftly he followed her, ha, ha, eagerly followed her, ho, ho. From the rank the greasy soil red bubbles oozed and stood, till it grew a putrid slime, and where his horse past her trod, the ground plashes with wet like blood, and chill terrors like a fungus grow. 2 witch babies, ho, ho, ho. There stayed the maiden, ha, ha, shed all her beauty, ho, ho. She shed her flower of beauty, grew lately old and dire, was the demon-ridden witch, and the consort of hell-fire. Am I, lovely noble knight? See thy heart's own desire. Now they come upon thee low. 2 witch babies, ho, ho, ho. Into the fogginess, ha, ha. Lo, she corrupted, ho, ho. Comes there a death, with the looks of a witch, and the joints that creak, looks like a night bird's scritch, and a beak that smokes like a smoking pitch, and the eyeless sockets aglow. 2 witch babies, ho, ho, ho. Close behind it, ha, ha, ah, close behind it, ho, ho. Come there a babe of bloated youth, with a curdled eye and a snaggy tooth, and a life no mortal dare speak its sooth, and its tongue like a worm doth show. 2 witch babies, ho, ho, ho. Its paunch a swollen, ha, ha, its life a swollen, ho, ho, like the hiatus dazed round, harsh wind its hum, and its paunch was rent, like a breast and drum, and the blubbered fat from its belly doth come with a sickened ooze, hell made it so. 2 witch babies, ho, ho, ho. And the poem goes on for a while, but that is a particular verse that Simon Webb was talking about when he's saying that it's talking about cutting open the abdomen. It's talking about these things, about how there are certain nasty and very sinister sides of the female. That's what more or less what Francis Thompson is sharing in that particular poem, and also saying things about, am I the noble knight, meaning that he was almost in the right and the woman was in the wrong, but really it's the line about how the abdomen is cut, and talking about the putrid slime and the oozing blood. I mean, these are very morbid things, and these are also very gruesome things, and very gory things, and they're just like, now wait a second, this guy is talking about a lot of the things that Jack the Ripper did in his poetry, and he is also someone who had this bad relationship with his family. He was having an affair with a prostitute. He has this type of conflicting, self-involved, self-serving religious ideal in his own mind. He is somebody who was a failed doctor who had medical knowledge, quality control inspector at a medical instrument factory. He has all of the knowledge to be Jack the Ripper. And here's something else, though, that Simon Webb talks about in the book Jack the Poet. And no matter whom your suspect is, what he says is the way that he believes Jack the Ripper was able to avoid capture was he would sneak around the alleys in Whitechapel, and that he would either change his clothes and put them into a bag, or go to a bucket of water, so to speak, and wash off the blood. And yeah, I could see that happening, but a different theory that has been put forward, and that has been discussed a lot with the theories involving the Jack the Ripper suspect Charles Lechmere, is that Jack the Ripper might have just simply removed his overcoat, committed the murders, and then put the overcoat on, and then people wouldn't see the blood. There are a couple different explanations, but that was Simon Webb's on how Jack the Ripper could have avoided being noticed with all that blood on him. But what do you think about Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect? You've more or less heard my take on the subject. I think that he matches a lot of the psychological markers. A lot of the psychological markers are in place. In terms of psychological profiling, yeah, sure, he was like just shy of his 30th birthday, and he went through a lot of turmoil in his 20s, bad relationships, definitely had the brain to be Jack the Ripper, but where's the hard evidence? Did he actually murder anyone? Where is the hard evidence? And I don't think that it is there. But that's my take on the subject. And one more time, the book that I've been discussing is Jack the Poet, was Francis Thompson, Jack the Ripper. And if you ever check it out, please put your ideas in the comment section down below. Feel free to respond to anything that I've said. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And of course, there is always BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. BlackBoxNed88 is also the name of the BuyMeACoffee.com page. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And if you like this episode, just simply hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And I will see you guys over on Cooper Friday talking about DB Cooper. Until next time.